Welcome back. If you're working with ServiceNow and wondering how to bring external data into your instance, well, this video is for you. Today, we're breaking down import sets and transform maps, the backbone of data import in ServiceNow. So let's start with import sets. An import set is a temporary staging table where external data is first loaded into ServiceNow. Think of it like a holding area. Your data lands here before being processed and then moved into real tables. So once your data is in the import set, what happens next? That's where transform maps come in. Now a transform map defines how data from the import set is mapped and moved into target tables like incident, user, or CMDB. It tells ServiceNow which fields to match, how data should be transformed, and what rules to apply during import. So let's briefly go back to import sets. So what can you actually import into an import set? So there are certain sources and external sources as well, such as CSV files, Excel spreadsheets, external database, and third-party systems. Essentially what we're going to look to demonstrate today is importing a CSV file and essentially transforming that. The example we have today, which we'll showcase in a moment, is loading 10 user records into ServiceNow into the user table from a spreadsheet. Now, a transfer map defines how data from an import set is actually transferred to the target table. So from the import table to the target table, what are the fields that are essentially going to match? Now, this specifies field mappings between source and target, the data transformation rules defining what the data would essentially be transformed as. So essentially, if you're loading data in, you might have certain fields that require some kind of updates or touch-ups to essentially be correctly transformed the right way into the ServiceNow target tables. And essentially you can do rules and scripts to essentially modify data before it's essentially pushed into the target table. And then there's logic for inserting and updating records. The transfer maps ensure that the import data is structured correctly and aligns with the target table schema. How do import sets and transform work? So this is the end-to-end process. Typically we would follow these steps when loading data. I'll briefly speak about these, go through them one by one, and then essentially we'll go and demo this and how we would essentially look to load data into ServiceNow. So the end-to-end process typically follows these steps. Firstly, you load data. You import the data into ServiceNow using a file or external source. You store the data into an import set table. Now this data is temporarily stored in a staging table. We then create a transfer map. Now we define how source fields map to target fields. We then configure the field mapping, then we match fields and apply transformation logic, and then essentially we run the transform. This executes the transformation process. Lastly, this will then insert update target table. So the data is then moved into the appropriate ServiceNow table. So let's go ahead and go with this demo, and then we'll come back to the key components of transform maps, and hopefully with demo the key components will make sense. So firstly, we want to get to the load data screen. So how do we get to the screen? So let's just go back to the home page and I'll quickly show how we navigate there. Essentially, from the application navigator, all you really want to do is search for load data. Now, you must be an admin to essentially have the ability to load data. Once you select load data, you then essentially get this interface. Now you could either create a table or use an existing import set table. Just for this example, we're going to create a new table. So we're just going to say this is a test user import. Okay, and then we're going to use the source of import. So we can either pick a data source, and you have a few examples here, or essentially a file. We're going to use a file for this demo. Then essentially I'm going to choose a file. So I'm going to go to my downloads, essentially pick this user import sample data, and I'll quickly show what this spreadsheet looks like in a moment. We're going to import the data from sheet 1 and header 1. So essentially if you have multiple sheets or you have multiple rows and you want to start from a certain row, you could essentially input this to start from row 10 or input this to start from sheet 2. So if I go to my sheet, this is essentially what we're looking to import. And essentially here we've got 10 rows that we want to look to import, and we've got all the columns essentially for user. Now I will show how I essentially created this template sheet and then essentially just filled in example data, but essentially there is a very quick way to for a target table that already exists to essentially build a spreadsheet template that you can then use to essentially fill in data or update if you also wanted to, and I'll show that there's a very quick way to do it in ServiceNow, so please do wait until the end of the video and I'll showcase that fun tip. Right, so coming back to this, we're going to go look to data, so load the data. So we'll create a table, we've labeled it the import set table, and we're going to go and submit. Okay, so essentially now we can see that it's processed 10, it's inserted 10 records, so there have been essentially no new records. Well, it's inserted 10 because it's a staging table. So now let's look at the import sets and load data. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So if we look at the import set rows, right, see if we can see what is loaded in. Okay, great. So here we can see all the fields that essentially come from our spreadsheet and essentially create all the fields in our import sets table. Great. And now if I go back to the load data, essentially same thing. We can see it's pending, there's no target record, and we can see all the data has come in. Great. So now let's go and create a transform map. So I'm going to click on create transform map. Okay, I'm going to use the transform target table. It's going to be the user table. So let's find the user table. System score user. There we go. Okay, we're going to keep the order as 100. Active run business rules, we're going to leave as yes for now. Enforce mandatory fields, we're going to leave no, because if personally I would say you would always want to look to enforce mandatory fields, but in order to do that you do need to do some analysis and make sure your fields are correct. Just because this is a demo, we're just going to push it in, but essentially it's always good to validate the mandatory fields, and whenever you create a transform map and data to ensure that the mandatory fields are filled in. Great. So essentially going to look to create a new record on empty coalesce fields, and coalesce fields, and we will talk about it in the core components, but essentially this is your unique value. So this is where you define what is your unique value. And then essentially if there is a unique value that exists for a record you're trying to upload or import, it will essentially update rather than insert. So it's very crucial to essentially have that identified. Great, so now I'm going to submit this. This is going to create my table transfer map, and I'm going to go back to the screen. Okay, so I'm on my input set now, and essentially let's take a look at the transfer maps. So if I click on this, I can see this is my test user transfer map that is identified with the source table. So let's click on test user transform, and essentially you could also always search for transfer maps on the application navigator. So if you weren't sure how I got there, I used the relate links for the source table, but essentially if I go to transform maps, yeah, just to showcase this. Great, and then I can see my test user transform, and essentially I can get to this field. So as you can see here, there is essentially this is where the field maps are generated. So we can see source field, target field, and we can see that essentially there is no mapping whatsoever. So if we were to transform this, essentially nothing will get transformed over to the target table. So you do need to make sure the first check is to check what the field mappings are and essentially do that. And then we can write some transform scripts to essentially add any additional logic that we want to apply to the data. So for the field maps, there's two ways you can essentially do this. You could either auto map matching fields, or you could use the mapping assist. Now, because we've actually created a template from a target table, the auto map matching field should work in the best way. So we're going to go with that, and I'll also very quickly show what the visual looks like from a mapping assist. So let's go and click auto map matching fields. And you can see here it's picked up the source field and the target field. Now, the way this works, it essentially looks at the kind of label of the columns, and essentially looks at any target fields that match that in the target table. And if the names are the same, it will essentially find the target fields. And if it essentially doesn't, then it won't look to map them. So we can see here 46 field maps have been essentially mapped correctly. And essentially I can use the mapping assist. So if I click on mapping assist, this will essentially show me the source, the field map, and essentially the target. So I can essentially see schedule is mapped to schedule, home phone is mapped to home phone, and I essentially can move this around if I wanted to change source with user ID as an example. So I'm just going to cancel that because I don't want to change anything. But essentially you can use that view to essentially go through and make sure that the mapping is correct. So now let's take a look at the coalesce. So we can see here we got home phone as false for coalesce, and that is correct. We don't want to use home phone as a unique identifier. If we essentially see, okay, right now we have no coalesces. So if I take a look at, in terms of this information, what I believe would be a unique would possibly be email. So we're going to use email as essentially the coalesce. Now this is just an example, but generally with users, it might be the user ID that you essentially want to coalesce. No, let's go with email for now. But yeah, so it all depends on what your data is. Usually user ID might be the best way to do coalesce, but we're just going to run with email as an example because I know they're unique for the data that I've essentially created in my sample data. So now I've got my mappings correct, and I've essentially created my coalesce. Now I'm going to go and click transform. So on relate links, I click transform. Okay, so it's using this import set data that we essentially recently just uploaded, and you can pick your different import sets depending on the data that you load. And essentially then I'm going to select the map. So you could have multiple maps depending on the import sources and how many maps you create. We've only got one, so we're going to look to transform this using this test user transform. And we can see now the state is complete. It's been a success, and let's take a look at the next step. So we could either go to the import sets for this data load, the transform history, and the import log. So let's take a look at each. Okay, so just refreshing this, great. Take a look at the import set. Okay, we can see here that we've got 10 rows that have essentially been imported, and they've all been inserted, so none of them essentially has been updated because there's been no user that has the same email. So if we were to load this again and change any values, it will essentially update these records. So we can see here John Doe. If I click on this record, it will take me to the exact record, and I can see the data that's come in. We've got John Doe, we've got the email, we've got the time zone, we've got the title, department, and this has all come from that sample data. So now if I go to the next screen, we've got the transform history. So this is a very good one to check, because essentially if you do have any import set row errors, where essentially you could not input the message. You could essentially add error messages to essentially check that. You could add log messages, so this is essentially where the additional logic you can add from the transform map to essentially highlight if there's any issues or any warnings to essentially provide. And then we've got the import log, so I believe this is the one. So that's essentially the end-to-end step in terms of importing data, and just like that, your data is now live in ServiceNow. So let's go back to the key components of transform maps. Now, field maps, as we've showcased, you can define how source fields map to target fields. Coalesce, this determines whether to insert new records or update existing ones. So this prevents duplicate records, ensuring you have the right coalesce and the right new unique value depending on the target table you are trying to import is very crucial when essentially managing and importing accurate data. Then we have transform scripts. This allows custom logic during transformation. This is essentially more of an advanced topic, and if you like, we can create a new video where we go over some transform scripts that you can look to create and how to utilize them. And transform events, essentially executing the logic at different stages. So you essentially might want to do it before you've imported the data or after you've imported the data. So some examples could be, before I'm importing data, I might want to do some verification of the data or validation of the data or cleanup of the data to essentially get it correct. However, after I transform the data, I might want to then create an additional record. So as an example, with these users that I've uploaded, I might also want to start a request for them to essentially get a new laptop. If I'm importing new data, new users, I might want also to create a script that goes, okay, now also create a request for them. So once I upload any new users, that essentially we get a request that goes out to the devices team to essentially request a new laptop for them. Okay, let's talk about common mistakes to avoid. So here's some common pitfalls. Not configuring coalesce fields. This could lead to duplicate data. So ensuring you have one coalesce field you identify as unique value. You may have multiple, and it really depends on your data, but essentially the best practice is to have one coalesce, one unique value. It all depends on your data and the target fields. But essentially identifying that very early on before you essentially upload data is crucial. Incorrect or missing field mappings. So essentially, if when we were doing the mapping, verifying that each field is actually mapped to a target field correctly, verifying that step by step is crucial. Skipping testing with sample data. So essentially, if you don't test this and you just try to load everything at once, you're most likely looking to fail. Always test it with sample data. Upload a few. Essentially, you'd always look to test this in a dev instance and test instance before you essentially upload or import data into production, and using small amounts of data to just verify that everything's looking fine before you load essentially the full batch. Ignoring transform errors. So if you do see any transform errors and logs based on that view that essentially we've looked at, and you do see any warnings or errors, do not ignore them. Take a look at them. Identify if there's any issues before moving ahead with promoting this to production. So let's talk about best practices. Test imports of small data sets first, and we briefly talked about that with the common pitfalls to avoid. Validate data before importing. So take a look at the data, verify everything looks correctly before importing the data. Use your coalesce fields carefully to avoid duplicates. Review your transform logs for errors, and use scripts only when necessary to keep logic simple. So do not look to create very advanced scripts. If you can, make it simple so that it's essentially easier to maintain, manage, and also troubleshoot if anything does go wrong. Now, before we end the video and go into the conclusion, I did promise you I will show you how there's an easy way to essentially create a template spreadsheet for a target table that already exists in ServiceNow. just to save a lot of time. So let's go to the user table. So I'm just going to go directly to the table, and we can see here we've got our users. Now essentially, if I go to click import, it will bring up with this user interface, and over here I can essentially look to insert data or update data. Now the difference with these two is essentially if I insert data, there is no column that comes which is called the sysid. Sysid is essentially a unique value of each record in the entire platform, and they're always unique. If I select update, the templated version will provide the sysid of the users. So essentially I can use that to coalesce and essentially import that data, and it will update the correct users. If I use insert, it won't have that sysid, and essentially when I'm uploading data, I will need to select a coalesce. So it all depends on what you're doing. But essentially, let's just use insert for the example here. Do you want to create an Excel template to enter data? Yes, I do. Include all fields in the template. Now, if you click, if you disable this, essentially what this will bring is all the fields you had originally in that list view when we clicked import. So if you want everything in the whole table, selecting this is crucial. However, if you have all the fields you just want to import, you know what they are, they're just a few fields, and essentially you could untick this and just configure your list view or personalize your list view to have the fields you need. So just for this example, we're going to include all fields in template. I'm going to go and create an Excel template. Now I'm just going to show what this looks like. So essentially you have your first directions. This is essentially just providing some instructions on how to add records. So we're just going to delete this tab for the time being, and what you will see here is we have all the fields in the user table. So if I just go actually here, we can see it's gone and put in all of this. And that's essentially how I've created that spreadsheet and was able to create some sample data to essentially then be able to upload this into ServiceNow. So to conclude, import sets and transform maps are powerful features in ServiceNow that enable efficient data integration. By understanding how to stage, map, and transform data properly, users can ensure accurate and reliable data imports into their ServiceNow environment. And that's import sets and transform maps in ServiceNow. Simple and powerful. If this helped, hit like button, subscribe for more ServiceNow tutorials. Got any questions, drop them in the comments and I will look to reply. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye.